They said these dogs were no longer useful, too old, too slow, too expensive to keep. But when a Navy SEAL walked into that forgotten kennel, something strange happened. The dogs did not bark. They did not growl. They stood up silently, one by one, like soldiers recognizing one of their own. One of them pressed its head against the metal bars, not asking for rescue, only asking to be seen. That was the moment he realized the truth. These dogs were not retired. They were being erased. And in that silence, he made a decision that would cost him his career, his safety, and everything he had left. But sometimes, when God puts loyalty in your hands, walking away is no longer an option. Winter sat heavily over coastal Virginia, the kind that didn't announce itself with snow but with damp wind and a sky the color of old steel. The Atlantic rolled in the distance, unseen yet unmistakable, its presence carried inland by the sharp scent of salt and cold water. Near the edge of the harbor, a decommissioned naval facility stood in quiet neglect, cranes frozen mid-task, warehouses hollowed out by time, and fences bowed as if tired of standing guard over nothing. Daniel Harper parked his vehicle just outside the rusted gate and shut off the engine. For a moment, he stayed where he was, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes forward. At 38, Daniel carried himself with the unspoken authority of someone who had spent most of his life following orders that could not be questioned and making decisions that could not be undone. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his frame compact with muscle, built for endurance rather than display. His dark brown hair was cut short in regulation style, with strands of gray already visible at the temples, and his face bore a faint scar along the left cheekbone, pale against weathered skin. His eyes, a muted blue-gray, were steady and observant, the kind that measured rooms and people without seeming to stare. He stepped out of the vehicle and adjusted the collar of his U.S. Army OCP camouflage jacket, the fabric stiff but familiar. The jacket fit him cleanly, paired with matching OCP trousers and well-worn brown combat boots. Daniel wore the uniform not for rank or recognition. He was off rotation, unofficially here, but because order mattered to him, especially in places where order had been allowed to decay. The gate creaked as he pushed it open, the sound echoing too loudly in the still air. Beyond it, the base stretched out in muted grays and browns. Windows were cracked or boarded. Paint peeled from walls like shedding skin. Signs warning of restricted access hung crooked, their authority long expired. This place had once been alive with motion, commands, and urgency. Now it felt like a breath held too long. Daniel walked forward, boots crunching softly on gravel. The wind slipped through broken fencing and rattled loose metal, carrying with it the smell of rust and old fuel. Somewhere deeper in the compound, a faint metallic tapping repeated at irregular intervals. Daniel slowed, listening. Years of training had taught him to trust sounds that didn't belong. He followed the noise past a maintenance shed and behind a low warehouse where stacked pallets and torn tarps formed a makeshift barrier. The air grew colder there, shaded and heavy. The tapping became clearer, metal against metal, soft but persistent, like something shifting rather than striking. A steel door stood half-hidden behind the pallets. Daniel reached for it and pulled. The hinges protested with a long, weary groan. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered weakly, casting a pale, uneven glow over concrete floors and narrow walls. The smell hit him immediately, cleaner, layered over fur, oil, and something else he recognized instantly. Waiting, the scent of animals that had learned stillness. Cages lined the walls, placed too close together, their bars worn smooth where bodies had leaned against them. Inside were German shepherds, one after another, their forms familiar to Daniel in a way few things were. These were working dogs, muscular, intelligent, disciplined, but now they sat or stood in silence. No barking, no lunging, just eyes tracking his movement with quiet intensity. Daniel's chest tightened as he took them in. He saw graying fur around muzzles, scars hidden beneath coats, tails that moved once and then stilled again. These dogs were trained to react, to engage. Their restraint was not calm. It was learned helplessness. At the far end of the room stood a woman holding a clipboard. Sarah Whitmore noticed him immediately. She was in her early 40s, slim and slightly stooped at the shoulders, as if she'd grown used to making herself smaller in crowded rooms. Her light brown hair was pulled back into a practical knot, a few loose strands framing a face marked by fine lines born of worry rather than age. Her hazel eyes were alert but cautious, the eyes of someone who watched more than she spoke. Sarah wore a plain navy jacket and practical boots, her clothing functional rather than expressive. She had once worked as a veterinary technician, a job she loved until funding cuts and personal upheaval forced her into civilian contract work. Since then, she had learned to survive by keeping her head down. People who knew her described her as kind, reliable, and quietly burdened by the things she was told not to question. "You're not scheduled to be here," she said, her voice calm but edged with surprise. Her gaze flicked briefly to Daniel's uniform, then back to his face. "I won't be long," Daniel replied. His voice was low, even, carrying the faint rasp of someone who had spent years breathing salt air and smoke. Sarah hesitated, then stepped aside with a small nod. It was not approval so much as resignation. As Daniel moved deeper into the room, one of the dogs shifted, claws clicking once against steel. The sound cut through the quiet. Daniel turned instinctively toward the farthest cage. There, apart from the others, stood Atlas. Atlas was nearly 9 years old, large even for a German shepherd. His body was still powerful, but time had begun to speak through subtle signs. Stiffness in his joints, the slower adjustment of his weight, the faint dulling of reflexes that only someone who knew him well would notice. His coat was dark along the spine, lighter at the sides, with gray creeping in around his muzzle. One ear carried a slight notch from an old injury, and a thin scar traced his shoulder where fur grew unevenly. His eyes were amber, deep and intelligent, and when they met Daniel's, the world narrowed. Atlas did not bark. He did not pace. He rose slowly to his feet, as if aware that sudden movement might shatter the moment. His gaze never left Daniel's face. Daniel stopped walking. Memory surged. Night runs along wet docks, the weight of a harness in his hands, breathing side by side in darkness. He stepped closer without realizing he had moved. Sarah watched from behind, her brow furrowing. "That one," she said quietly, nodding toward Atlas, "hasn't reacted to anyone in weeks." Daniel didn't answer. He stopped at the bars, close enough to see the fine dusting of gray on Atlas's muzzle, close enough to feel the heat of the dog's breath against cold steel. Atlas stepped forward and pressed his forehead gently against the bars. Daniel's jaw tightened. He lowered himself into a crouch, the fabric of his OCP trousers whispering against concrete. He placed his gloved hand flat against the metal between them, not reaching through, not touching, close enough to matter. Around them, the other dogs watched. Some shifted, some sat. All of them felt the change. The wind rattled the building faintly. Somewhere outside, a buoy clanged in the harbor, marking time for ships that no longer came here. Daniel held Atlas's gaze, understanding settling heavy and undeniable in his chest. This was not a temporary holding area. This was not retirement. This was the space between usefulness and disposal. He rose slowly and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Atlas shifted forward in response. No names were spoken, none were needed. They recognized each other. And in that forgotten place, that recognition meant everything. The conference room overlooked a different stretch of water, far from the rusted harbor and forgotten cages. This water was calm, blue-gray, under a polished sky, framed by wide glass windows that reflected efficiency and control. The building sat on the outskirts of Arlington, pristine and modern, its corridors quiet except for the hum of climate control and the soft rhythm of shoes against tile. It was the kind of place where decisions were made without ever touching the consequences. At the long table sat 3 men and 1 woman, each with folders aligned precisely in front of them. At the head was Marcus Hale, mid-50s, tall and lean with silver hair combed neatly back and a face shaped by decades of negotiation rather than hardship. Marcus was the CEO of Vanguard Strategic Solutions, a private security contractor whose public image revolved around innovation and reliability. His tailored suit fit perfectly, his hands steady as he turned pages, and his expression carried the practiced calm of someone who believed numbers told the only truth that mattered. He was known for being polite, persuasive, and utterly unmoved by sentiment, a man who had built his career on replacing older systems with newer ones and calling it progress. Beside him sat Evelyn Cross, early 40s, sharp-featured and impeccably dressed, her posture straight and her gaze alert. She served as Vanguard's Director of Government Relations, a former policy advisor who had learned early that survival in bureaucratic systems depended on anticipation rather than reaction. Evelyn spoke little in meetings, but when she did, people listened. She believed deeply in structure and efficiency, not out of cruelty but conviction, shaped by years spent watching underfunded programs collapse because no one was willing to make hard cuts. Across from them were 2 representatives from a procurement advisory board, civilian consultants whose names mattered less than their signatures. One was Thomas Reed, heavy-set and balding, with tired eyes and a habit of clearing his throat before speaking, a man who had once served in logistics and still clung to the belief that systems, once optimized, could fix anything. The other was Alan Price, younger, restless, fingers tapping lightly against his pen as if even sitting still felt inefficient to him. The documents before them were immaculate. Charts displayed projected savings. Timelines showed rapid deployment of new K-9 units, younger, faster, cheaper to ensure. Phrases like operational readiness and streamlined assets appeared repeatedly, each word carefully chosen to sound neutral, inevitable. At no point did the papers mention individual dogs. They referred instead to units, inventories, and turnover rates. Marcus Hale leaned forward slightly and smiled, the gesture warm without being personal. He spoke about modernization, about aligning military-adjacent operations with current demands. He emphasized that Vanguard's dogs would be sourced young, trained intensively, and rotated out before age-related decline impacted performance. He did not say what happened to those rotated out. He did not need to. Pens moved, signatures were placed, ink dried. Far below the waterline of these discussions, other paperwork shifted hands. Digital files were opened, edited, and resaved. Performance evaluations for existing K-9s were shortened, language softened or sharpened where needed. Passes became marginal. Marginal became unsuitable. Medical notes that once read manageable wear now read declining capacity. The changes were subtle enough to pass inspection, clean enough to avoid alarms. No single edit told a lie, but together they formed one. Back in coastal Virginia, the effects of those signatures were already settling into place. Sarah Whitmore sat alone at a narrow desk just outside the kennel area, the fluorescent light above her flickering intermittently. She had removed her jacket and draped it over the back of the chair, revealing a simple gray sweater that hung loosely on her slender frame. Her shoulders sloped forward as she leaned over a stack of printed reports, her fingers smudged with ink where she had marked inconsistencies she wasn't supposed to notice. Sarah had always been observant. It was both her strength and the reason she had learned to stay quiet. She skimmed one evaluation again, her brow tightening. The language felt wrong. The dog in question was 6, not old, active, no record of mission failure, and yet the final assessment read no longer suitable for continued service. Sarah's jaw set. Years earlier, she had spoken up about a misdiagnosed injury at a different facility and been labeled difficult, the kind of word that lingered long after apologies were offered. Since then, she had learned to survive by absorbing frustration silently, by helping where she could without drawing attention. From inside the kennel came a low sound, not a bark, but a soft exhale, followed by the faint scrape of claws. Sarah looked. Daniel Harper stood near the far end of the enclosure, his back straight, hands resting loosely at his sides. He had not left after their earlier exchange. He hadn't asked permission to stay either. There was something about his presence that altered the space, as if the air had thickened slightly around him. He watched the dogs with a focus that felt almost protective, his gaze moving slowly from cage to cage, memorizing details. Atlas lay down inside his enclosure, forelegs crossed neatly, head lifted. Though his body appeared relaxed, his eyes never left Daniel. Nearby, another German shepherd shifted restlessly. This one was Ranger, a sable-coated male just past 7, leaner than Atlas with a narrower face and a perpetually alert posture. Ranger had once specialized in explosives detection, his nose legendary among handlers. Now his ears twitched at every sound, uncertainty replacing confidence. Sarah stood and approached Daniel, her footsteps quiet. "They're not supposed to be here long," she said, keeping her voice low. "Temporary holding, that's what we were told." Daniel didn't look at her. "Temporary for what?" Sarah hesitated. She glanced toward the office door, then back to the dogs. "Reassignment," she said finally. "On paper." Daniel turned then, and she met his eyes. There was no accusation in them, just expectation. It unsettled her more than anger would have. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the tarp stacked against the fence. A gull cried somewhere above, its voice sharp and lonely. The dogs reacted subtly, heads lifting, bodies tensing. Years of conditioning did not vanish simply because a system decided it no longer needed them. That same afternoon, a courier delivered sealed envelopes to the base administrative office. Inside were updated directives, printed and official. They outlined procedures for decommissioning K-9 assets, timelines for transfer, conditions for release. The language was clean, clinical, impossible to argue with without seeming emotional. One clause noted that dogs not reassigned within a specified window would be transferred to external facilities for further processing. No one said the word disposal. Sarah read the directive once, then again. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it down. She thought of Atlas's steady gaze, of Ranger's restless pacing, of the quiet dignity with which they waited. She thought of her first job, of the promise she had made to herself to protect animals who could not speak. The memory stung. In the kennel, Daniel remained, absorbing the truth of the place without reading a single document. He didn't need paperwork to recognize betrayal. He had seen it before, in different forms, wearing different uniforms. Atlas rose and stepped closer to the bars again. Daniel approached, stopping just short. The dog's breathing slowed, sinking unconsciously with the man standing before him. Outside, forces moved, contracts signed, orders issued, but in this small space something older and simpler held. Above the waterline, decisions had been made. Below it, consequences waited, and neither the dogs nor the man watching them had any intention of disappearing quietly. The cold bit hard as Daniel dropped to one knee, his OCP trousers brushing the concrete. The kennel felt tighter now, the air heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere, water dripped. Atlas stood directly in front of him, close enough that Daniel could see the faint tremor in the dog's breathing. "Atlas," Daniel said quietly. No bark came. That absence hit harder than noise ever could. Atlas had always barked once when he saw him. Not excitement. Confirmation. Now there was nothing. The dog stepped forward instead, slow and careful, and pressed his forehead against the steel bars. Metal rang softly. Atlas didn't pull away. Daniel placed his gloved hand flat against the bars. He didn't reach through. He waited. Atlas leaned in harder, breath fogging the steel, eyes locked on Daniel's. Strong body, controlled posture, everything still there, except the voice. Footsteps approached from behind. Daniel didn't turn. Dr. Elaine Porter stopped a few feet away. She was in her late 50s, compact and steady, gray hair cut short for practicality. Years of veterinary work had left her hands sure, and her movements economical. She wore a white coat that had seen too many facilities like this one. Elaine was known for precision and restraint, shaped by a career that punished open resistance and rewarded quiet documentation. "He should be barking," Daniel said. Elaine nodded once. "He used to." That was all the confirmation Daniel needed. Elaine crouched, keeping her movements small. "These dogs were put through evaluations," she said. "Longer cycles, less recovery, stacked stressors." "Training," Daniel said. "No," Elaine replied. "Training has limits. This didn't." Atlas shifted closer, forehead still pressed to steel. Daniel felt it immediately. The tension wasn't fear. It was control. Elaine pulled a folded sheet from her coat and held it out. Not official. Handwritten notes, stress markers, cortisol spikes, delayed recovery. Alongside older entries showing clean baselines and normal performance. "They passed," Daniel said. "Yes," Elaine answered, "until the standards changed." The truth settled fast, heavy, clean. A sound broke through the stillness, nails clicking. Ranger paced in the next cage, tight circles, ears flicking at every noise. Ranger was leaner than Atlas, younger, sable-coated, eyes sharp but restless. Once an explosives dog, now wound too tight, scanning for threats that never came. "They learned," Elaine said. Reacting brought more tests, more pressure. Silence became safer. Daniel looked back at Atlas. The dog didn't move, didn't whine, didn't bark. He had adapted. Sarah Whitmore appeared at the doorway. Slim, shoulders slightly drawn in, gray sweater loose against her frame. Her hazel eyes moved quickly from Daniel to Elaine to the dogs. She had always been observant. That was her problem. "What's happening?" Sarah asked. Elaine didn't soften it. "They're being broken on paper so they can be removed." Sarah's grip tightened on her clipboard. She didn't argue. She didn't ask for proof. She had seen enough small wrongs turn permanent to recognize the shape of a larger one. A low whine rose from farther down the row, then stopped abruptly. The kennel went still again. Daniel leaned closer to Atlas. "You don't have to prove anything," he said. Atlas exhaled slowly, stayed silent, chose closeness over sound. Daniel understood then. Atlas hadn't lost his bark. He had buried it, not from weakness, from learning that being needed was no longer guaranteed. Daniel stood. He didn't step away. Above them, decisions kept moving through clean offices. Below, a dog who had once barked without hesitation waited in silence. Daniel squared his shoulders and stayed right where he was. Atlas watched him do it, and that was enough to change the direction of everything. The memory came without warning, pulled loose by the smell of cold metal and the quiet weight of Atlas's silence. Daniel stood in the kennel, but the walls thinned and the sound of the harbor bled through his thoughts until he was no longer there. He was back on the water years earlier, on a night without a moon, when the sea swallowed light and kept its secrets. The vessel had been a rust-streaked cargo ship drifting just beyond the shipping lanes, its silhouette barely visible against the black horizon. Waves slammed into its hull with dull, punishing rhythm, spray tearing sideways in the wind. Daniel remembered the cold first, sharp and biting through his gloves, and the way the deck pitched beneath his boots as if testing his balance. He had been younger then, his movements quicker, his certainty sharper, his uniform soaked through with salt before the mission even began. Atlas had moved ahead of the team, muscles coiled, nose cutting through chaos with practiced ease. Back then, Atlas was all focus and confidence, ears forward, tail steady, every step deliberate. He had been 5 years old, at the height of his strength, coat sleek and eyes bright with purpose. Daniel had trusted him without question, the way you trust gravity to pull you down or air to fill your lungs. Atlas didn't hesitate. He never did. The team followed in silence, boots gripping wet steel, rifles held close. The wind tore at them, carrying the metallic taste of fuel and the faint echo of voices somewhere below deck. Daniel remembered the sound of Atlas's breathing, steady and controlled, a rhythm he matched without realizing it. Fear existed, but it stayed behind training, buried under repetition and trust. The explosion came from nowhere. It wasn't loud at first. It was pressure, a sudden force that shoved the world sideways. Fire bloomed along the deck, heat flashing across Daniel's face as the shockwave knocked him hard against a railing. Metal screamed. The deck buckled. For a split second, everything dissolved into noise and light. Daniel hit the ground and rolled, his vision blurring as flames licked across the steel where he had stood moments earlier. He tried to push himself up, but the deck lurched again, and pain flared down his left side. He remembered thinking distantly that something had gone wrong in the sequence, that there shouldn't have been fuel there, that someone had miscalculated. Atlas was there instantly. Daniel felt teeth clamp onto his harness, strong and certain, and then he was being pulled, dragged away from the fire that surged higher with every second. Atlas didn't bark. He didn't hesitate. He dug his claws into slick metal and hauled Daniel clear, ignoring the heat that singed his fur and the debris raining down around them. Daniel remembered the sound Atlas made then, a low, relentless growl born of effort and urgency, not fear. They reached cover just as another blast ripped through the deck. The ship groaned, wounded and angry, and the sea rose to meet it. Daniel rolled onto his side, coughing, vision clearing enough to see Atlas standing over him, body tense, eyes locked on his face as if checking for life. Daniel had nodded once. Atlas had turned away immediately, ready to move again. That was when Daniel saw the other man. His name had been Ethan Miller, a SEAL like Daniel, broad-chested and dark-haired, with an easy grin that had earned him friends everywhere he went. Ethan had been the kind of man who filled space without trying, whose confidence made others steadier. He had been 32, recently married, his wedding ring tucked into a chain beneath his uniform because regulations didn't allow jewelry on missions. He had joked about it on the boat ride out, promising to put it back on when he returned. Ethan lay several yards away, half shielded by a twisted section of railing. Fire burned between him and the rest of the team. He was still conscious, chest rising shallowly, eyes unfocused but searching. Daniel started toward him without thinking, pain screaming through his body as he pushed himself up. Atlas moved first. The dog surged forward, weaving through smoke and debris, ignoring shouted commands that dissolved into the wind. Daniel followed as fast as he could, each step an effort. Atlas reached Ethan and circled him, nose pressed briefly to his chest, assessing in seconds what would take others minutes. He whined once, soft and urgent, then looked back at Daniel. They reached Ethan together. Daniel dropped beside him, hands slick with blood he couldn't immediately place. Ethan's breathing rattled, wet and uneven. He tried to speak, failed, then tried again. Atlas lowered himself beside Ethan, pressing close, warmth against failing strength. Ethan's hand lifted shakily and found the dog's head, fingers threading into thick fur with surprising clarity. His touch steadied there, a small anchor in a world breaking apart. "Good boy," Ethan whispered, voice barely audible over the roar of the fire and sea. It wasn't a command. It was gratitude. Daniel felt the moment stretch, thin and fragile. He knew then, with the brutal certainty soldiers learned too late, that there would be no extraction for Ethan. Not in time. The ship was dying. The mission was already lost. Ethan's gaze shifted to Daniel. There was no fear in it, only apology and something like peace. His lips moved again, forming words Daniel would replay for years without sound. "Take care of them." Daniel nodded, unable to speak. He reached for Ethan's shoulder, but Ethan's hand tightened briefly in Atlas's fur instead, as if the promise mattered more there. Atlas remained perfectly still, ears lowered, body pressed close, understanding in a way that defied training manuals. When Ethan's hand finally slipped, Atlas nudged it once, gently, as if trying to wake him. Then he stilled, posture changing, recognizing the absence. He did not howl. He did not bark. He simply sat, pressed close to the body, refusing to move until Daniel placed a hand on his collar. They left the ship minutes later, pulled back by the team as the vessel burned behind them. The sea swallowed the wreckage, flames hissing into black water. Daniel remembered standing on the extraction boat, soaked and shaking, Atlas beside him, fur singed, eyes fixed on the place where Ethan had disappeared. The wind tore at them, carrying smoke and loss out into the dark. Back in the present, Daniel exhaled slowly, the kennel snapping back into focus around him. His hands trembled once before he stilled them. Atlas stood where he had been, forehead against steel, eyes steady but distant. The past had not faded for either of them. It had only learned to wait. Daniel understood now why Atlas no longer barked. That night, the sea had taken a man. It had also taken something from a dog who had learned that loyalty did not always end in return. Daniel rested his hand against the bars again, grounding himself in the present. Atlas shifted closer. The bond held. It always had. And from that night forward, Daniel had known one thing with absolute clarity. Atlas was not a tool. He was not an asset. He was family. The evaluation started fast and wrong. Folding tables scraped against concrete, tablets lit up, clipboards snapped open. The kennel felt tighter, colder, the damp air pressing down as if it knew what was coming. Daniel stood near the cages, straight-backed in his OCP uniform, unmoving while everything else shifted around him. He didn't like the pace. He didn't like the way the evaluators avoided the dog's eyes. Grant Holloway took charge immediately. Stocky, shaved head, movements sharp and efficient, he spoke like a man who believed speed equaled control. Leah Monroe followed half a step behind him, slim, younger, dark hair pulled tight, her eyes already uneasy. Leah had studied animal behavior. She had joined this work believing she could make it better. It showed in the way her hands hesitated before typing. Baseline observation began. No introductions, no easing in. The dogs felt it instantly. Ranger's pacing tightened. His claws clicked faster, breath shallow. Knox stood rigid in his cage, massive frame locked in place, eyes too wide. Knox was 8, thick-necked and broad-chested, once famous for holding position under gunfire without flinching. Now his tail hung low, muscles trembling beneath dark fur. Daniel saw it before anyone else did. Knox swayed. Just a fraction. Enough. Then his legs buckled. The sound of his body hitting concrete was heavy and final. Knox collapsed in on himself, sides heaving, paws scraping uselessly as his breath came fast and broken. His eyes rolled, unfocused. A sharp inhale tore from Leah's throat. "He's down," she said. Atlas exploded upward. No bark, no snarl, just power. He surged to the bars, metal ringing as his body hit it. Ranger froze, pressed tight against his own cage, a low vibration humming in his chest. Down the line, other dogs rose, leaned forward, cages shuddering in a wave that felt alive. Not chaos, alarm, silent and contagious. Grant stepped back. "What the hell?" "Open the cage," Dr. Elaine Porter said, already moving. Her voice cut clean, calm, and hard. She was on one knee in seconds, gray hair tight against her head, hands steady as stone. "That's not procedure," Grant snapped. "Neither is letting him die," Elaine replied. Daniel stepped forward, and the argument ended. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch anyone. He placed himself between the evaluators and the cages, shoulders squared, presence absolute. A wall. "Open it," he said. The latch clicked. Elaine slid inside Knox's cage, her movements fast and practiced. She grounded him with her voice, firm hands stabilizing his chest. Knox's body jerked once, then again, breath fighting for rhythm. Atlas pressed harder against the bars, a low sound breaking free despite his control. Not a bark. Something deeper. Sarah Whitmore stood frozen near the wall. Slim, pale, gray sweater hanging loose, clipboard clutched too tight. She had seen injuries. She had never seen collapse like this, not from age, from overload. Leah's tablet slipped from her fingers and hit the table with a hollow knock. She didn't pick it up. She was staring at Knox, then at Atlas, then at Daniel. The clean logic she'd been trained on cracked in real time. Knox's breathing slowed under Elaine's guidance. Tremors eased, leaving him drained, eyes glassy. He turned his head slightly, gaze finding Atlas through the bars. Atlas stilled. Their eyes met. Something passed between them that didn't need words. The room went silent. Grant cleared his throat, weaker now. "We'll suspend," he said. "Document the incident." Daniel didn't move. Sarah stepped forward before she could stop herself. Her voice shook once, then steadied. "That wasn't age," she said. "You can't write that as age." Grant's eyes flashed. "You're not qualified." "No," Sarah said quietly. "But I know neglect when I see it." Elaine looked up, her expression hard. "These dogs were pushed without recovery," she said. This outcome was predictable. Leah swallowed. "This should be reported," she said. Soft, real. Grant said nothing. Atlas stayed on his feet, alert, watching Daniel. Daniel met his gaze and held it. The dogs needed that, proof that someone was still here. Wind slammed once against the building, then faded. The evaluation was over. Something else had begun. Behind iron bars, one dog had fallen. No one in that room could pretend they hadn't seen it. The kennel did not return to normal after Knox collapsed. It never could. The evaluators left quickly, their efficiency unraveling into avoidance, tablets tucked away without their usual certainty. The folding tables were cleared, but the air stayed charged, thick with the kind of truth that clung to walls and followed people home. Daniel remained where he was long after the others moved on, standing in front of the cages as if his presence alone could hold the line. Atlas stayed upright, eyes tracking him, body still tense, but no longer alone in it. That night, after the facility lights dimmed and the harbor outside slipped into fog, Daniel began working. He did not storm offices or demand answers. He requested access. He asked questions in the same calm tone he had used in briefings and debriefings for most of his life. He knew systems. He knew where paper trails thinned and where they lied by omission. Sarah Whitmore watched him move through the administrative wing with quiet focus, his posture controlled, his questions precise. She had spent years learning how to survive by not being noticed. Watching Daniel, she saw a different strategy. He was impossible to ignore, not because he demanded attention, but because he refused to bend. Sarah was the first to help. She told herself it was small, harmless, a misplaced file, an access code she still had but was no longer supposed to use. She was tall and slender, her movements economical, her expression carefully neutral, shaped by years of learning when to speak and when silence cost less. She had once believed that doing her job well was enough. Knocks on the concrete had ended that belief. When she handed Daniel a stack of original evaluation reports, her hands shook only once. "These aren't what they submitted," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. He already knew. The differences were subtle. language softened or sharpened just enough to change meaning. Phrases like operationally sound replaced with showing early signs of decline, recovery times extended by hours that had never existed, stress markers reclassified as behavioral concerns. One change alone meant nothing. Together they told a story. Doctor. Elaine Porter joined them the next morning. She brought her own files, copied carefully over weeks, her methodical nature finally aligning with necessity. Elaine was not a dramatic woman. She believed in process. She believed in evidence. What she had seen in the kennel had stripped her of patience. She laid out her notes in neat rows, her voice steady as she explained how thresholds had been adjusted just enough to guarantee failure. They didn't want confirmation, she said. They wanted justification. Daniel listened. He always did. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he gathered the papers and organized them with military precision. He knew this phase: intelligence gathering, verification, timing. The emails took longer. They had been partially deleted, buried under layers of routine correspondence. Daniel spent hours in a small office with flickering lights, scrolling through threads that spoke in euphemisms. Asset turnover, contractual alignment, future readiness. He found one message that hadn't been scrubbed clean enough, a forwarded note with a margin comment left intact. We need the older units off the books before Q3. Daniel stared at the screen until the words lost meaning and became pure intent. By the third day, Sarah stopped pretending she was just assisting. She stayed late without excuses, her ponytail loosening as the hours passed, eyes red but sharp. She spoke less, but when she did, it mattered. They flagged these dogs as liabilities, she said once, pointing to a column of numbers. Insurance costs, payouts, they turned loyalty into a line item. Daniel closed the file. That was enough. The lawyer came next, not through official channels, but through an old contact Daniel trusted. Her name was Rebecca Shaw. She was 34, with dark hair cut just past her jaw and eyes that missed nothing. Rebecca dressed plainly, favoring dark slacks and a fitted jacket that allowed movement rather than display. Her voice was calm, measured, shaped by years of standing in rooms where people expected her to back down. She did not. Rebecca had lost her older brother 8 years earlier in a naval operation that never made headlines. The official report cited equipment failure. She had learned to read between lines long before law school. Military justice was her specialty, not because she admired it, but because she understood its blind spots. She reviewed Daniel's evidence in silence, her fingers moving steadily through pages, eyes narrowing only once. When she finished, she looked up at him. "This isn't mismanagement," she said. "This is deliberate." Daniel nodded. "Can it be proven?" Rebecca tapped the email printout. "Yes, but not inside their system." That was the moment. Daniel felt it settle in his chest, heavy and final. He had followed orders his entire adult life. He had trusted structures, even flawed ones, because chaos helped no one. But this was not chaos. This was design. Sending the evidence outside the system meant consequences, investigations, headlines, retaliation. He knew how institutions responded when exposed. He had seen it done to others. Careers stalled, access revoked, silence enforced through isolation. Rebecca didn't sugarcoat it. "Once this moves," she said, "there's no stepping back." Daniel thought of Atlas, standing silent behind steel. He thought of Knox collapsing, of Ranger pacing until the floor itself seemed to wear thin beneath him. He thought of Ethan on the burning deck, hand tangled in fur, trust given without condition. "I know," Daniel said. They worked through the night. Rebecca prepared a formal packet, airtight, indexed, cross-referenced. Elaine added medical affidavits. Sarah provided timestamps and internal routing logs that showed who had altered what and when. Daniel wrote a statement that stuck to facts and cut like a blade. At dawn, fog rolled in from the harbor, swallowing the base in pale gray. Daniel stood outside for a moment, cold air burning his lungs, then sent the files through an encrypted channel Rebecca had set up. The confirmation ping came seconds later. It was done. When Daniel returned to the kennel, Atlas was awake, watching the doorway. He rose as Daniel approached, body still, eyes steady. Daniel stopped in front of the cage, his reflection faint in the steel. "I didn't stay quiet," Daniel said softly. Atlas did not bark. He stepped forward and pressed close, breath slow, presence solid. That was enough. Down the row, Ranger settled for the first time in days. Knox slept, exhausted but alive. The dogs felt the shift before anyone announced it. Above the waterline, files landed on desks where they were never meant to appear. Below it, a Navy SEAL who had followed orders his entire life finally chose not to. And silence lost its power. The meeting room felt smaller than it should have. Long table, low ceiling, fluorescent lights that hummed just loudly enough to keep everyone on edge. Outside, the harbor was wrapped in morning fog, the water invisible beyond the windows, as if the world itself had chosen not to look in. Daniel stood near the back at first, hands relaxed at his sides, OCP uniform crisp and unyielding against the gray walls. Around the table sat men and women who had learned to speak in careful phrases, their folders stacked neatly, their eyes already tired. Captain Harold Whitman sat at the head. He was in his early 60s, broad through the shoulders but softened by age, his once dark hair now white and closely cropped. Whitman had served most of his life in uniform and still carried himself like a man who believed in structure. His problem was not cruelty. It was compromise. Years of balancing orders from above against loyalty to those below had worn him thin. Beside him sat a civilian administrator named Paul Keegan, tall and narrow-faced, glasses perched low on his nose. Keegan's suit was expensive, his posture rigid, his expression carefully neutral. He spoke the language of budgets fluently and rarely raised his voice. People like Keegan did not shout. They waited for systems to do the damage for them. Sarah Whitmore sat against the wall, notebook closed on her lap. She had not been invited to speak. That alone told her everything. She sat straight anyway, shoulders squared, chin lifted. She had spent years shrinking herself. Today, she refused. Rebecca Shaw sat 2 seats down from Daniel, calm and unreadable. Her dark hair framed her face sharply, eyes steady, posture relaxed but alert. She looked like someone who had already calculated every outcome and chosen her ground carefully. She met Daniel's gaze once, a silent confirmation. The meeting opened with procedure. Reports referenced. Incidents acknowledged without detail. Words like unfortunate and under review floated through the room, weightless and empty. Knox's collapse was discussed as an anomaly. The dogs were referred to as units. Daniel listened. When Captain Whitman finally paused and asked if there were any further considerations, the room exhaled as one. People shifted. Pens stopped moving. Silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Daniel stepped forward. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't ask permission. He placed his hands flat on the table and leaned in slightly, forcing everyone to look at him. The room stilled. "I'll take them," Daniel said. Keegan frowned. "Take what?" "All of them," Daniel replied. His voice was calm, steady, impossible to misinterpret. "Every dog currently held in that facility." A ripple moved through the room. Chairs creaked. Someone laughed once, short and disbelieving. Captain Whitman straightened. "That's not how this works." Daniel didn't look away. "I know exactly how it works." Keegan adjusted his glasses. "You're talking about liability, housing, medical care. These are assets under review." "They're living beings," Daniel said, "and they're done being reviewed." Rebecca leaned forward slightly. "My client is prepared to assume full legal responsibility," she said evenly, including housing, medical expenses, rehabilitation, and long-term care. Whitman stared at Daniel. You can't just decide this. I already did, Daniel said. No conditions, no negotiation. You release them to me, or this moves further than you want it to. The words landed heavy. Keegan's jaw tightened. Whitman looked away for a moment, toward the window, toward the fog hiding the water. He had seen this before. A line drawn, someone refusing to step back. What happens when the investigation concludes? Whitman asked quietly. They won't be here anymore, Daniel said, and neither will the problem. Silence again, longer this time. Whitman closed his eyes briefly, then nodded once. Not approval, acceptance. We'll draft temporary transfer orders, he said, pending final review. Daniel straightened. I want them today. Keegan scoffed. That's unrealistic. Rebecca didn't raise her voice. It's necessary. The room shifted, systems adjusted, decisions bent. The meeting ended without ceremony. People filed out quickly, eyes averted, conversations hushed. Sarah stood as Daniel passed her. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes were bright, something like relief breaking through years of restraint. The kennel smelled the change before anyone said a word. Daniel walked in alone at first, boots echoing softly on concrete. The dogs were quiet, alert, watching. Atlas stood at the front of his cage, ears forward, posture tense but hopeful. Ranger sat instead of pacing. Knox lay on his side, chest rising slow and even, exhaustion still heavy on him. Daniel stopped in front of Atlas. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Atlas stepped forward, not fast, not uncertain. He closed the space between them and lowered his head, resting it against Daniel's gloved hand through the bars. The contact was deliberate, chosen. Daniel's breath caught once before he steadied it. He didn't speak. He didn't move away. Sarah watched from the doorway, her hand covering her mouth. She had never seen a dog make a decision like that. Not obedience. Trust. Elaine Porter stood beside her, arms crossed, eyes softening. She had seen animals recover before. She had never seen them choose. Down the row, Ranger lay down fully for the first time since arriving. Knox shifted and slept on. The tension that had lived in the room for weeks began to ease, not gone, but quieter. Daniel stayed there, hand still, letting Atlas set the pace. No commands, no training cues, just presence. Above the harbor, the fog began to lift, thin bands of light cutting through gray. The world outside resumed its motion, unaware of the line that had just been crossed inside a forgotten building. Daniel had followed orders his entire life. Today he chose something else, and the dogs knew it. Morning came gently to the land, not with alarms or commands, but with light. The sun rose over the outskirts of the county, spilling gold across open fields and low wooden fences, warming ground that had once been neglected and now carried quiet purpose. A year had passed since iron bars and clipped evaluations had tried to decide the worth of living beings. Here, there were no clipboards, no fluorescent lights, no cages rattling shut. Daniel Harper stood on the porch of a modest farmhouse, a mug of coffee cooling in his hand. He still wore his OCP uniform out of habit rather than requirement, the fabric softened by time but kept clean and precise. The uniform no longer marked authority. It marked continuity. Daniel looked older than he had a year ago, not from wear, but from release. The lines in his face had eased. His shoulders, once permanently squared for impact, now rested naturally, though readiness never fully left him. Atlas lay at his feet, stretched out in the early sun. His muzzle was grayer now, his movements slower, but his breathing was deep and even. The tension that once coiled beneath his skin finally unwound. He had chosen this spot every morning since the move, close enough to feel Daniel's presence, far enough to claim his own space. When a breeze passed through the grass, Atlas lifted his head, ears flicking once, then settled again. No need to react. Nothing to prove. Beyond the porch, the other dogs moved freely. Ranger trotted along the fence line, nose low, working a scent trail purely for the pleasure of it. His lean body moved with renewed confidence, the tight pacing replaced by long, easy strides. Knox lay beneath a broad oak tree, massive frame relaxed in the shade, chest rising slow and steady. He still tired more easily than the others, but his eyes no longer carried the hollow edge of collapse. He slept deeply now, the kind of sleep earned by safety. The land itself had changed. What had once been an abandoned property on the county's edge had become a place of structure without confinement. Fences defined boundaries without trapping. Training platforms stood unused most days, not as tools of demand, but as options. A long, low barn housed medical supplies, shaded rest areas, and wide-open stalls that remained open by default. Nothing here locked from the outside. Sarah Whitmore emerged from the barn carrying a crate of supplies, her steps light despite the weight. She wore faded jeans and a simple jacket, her hair pulled back loosely, strands catching the light. She had moved here 3 months earlier after resigning quietly from her contract position. The decision had cost her stability, but given her something she had not felt in years. Alignment. Sarah was still slender, still careful in her movements, but the tension that once folded her inward had softened. She spoke more now, laughed occasionally. She still watched closely, still noticed everything, but no longer felt the need to disappear. The night Knox collapsed had broken something in her. This place had rebuilt it. She set the crate down and knelt to greet Ranger as he approached, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "Easy," she murmured, smiling when he leaned into her touch. Ranger wagged his tail once, restrained but sincere. A truck pulled into the gravel drive, tires crunching softly. Dr. Elaine Porter stepped out, adjusting her jacket against the morning chill. She looked much the same as always, gray hair neat, posture steady, but her eyes softened when she took in the scene. Elaine had come twice a week at first, then less as the dog stabilized. Now she visited because she wanted to, because she trusted what she saw here. "They look good," she said, approaching Daniel. "They are," Daniel replied. He meant it. Elaine crouched near Knox, checking his breathing out of habit more than concern. "You did right by them," she said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "They did right by me." Later that morning, Rebecca Shaw arrived unannounced, as she often did. She parked near the fence and walked in without ceremony, dark jacket buttoned against the breeze, eyes scanning the property with professional instinct she hadn't quite shed. Rebecca still handled military cases, still fought systems from the inside when she could. The investigation had ended months ago. Consequences had followed. Quiet ones. Enough. She stopped beside Daniel on the porch. "No new developments," she said. "Just wanted to see them." Daniel nodded. "You're welcome any time." Rebecca watched Atlas lift his head and look at Daniel, then rest again. "That one," she said. "He trusts you." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. By midday, the dogs gathered naturally in the open field, drawn together by nothing more than shared history. Ranger lay beside Knox. 2 younger dogs Daniel had taken in later, retired from different units, joined them cautiously, accepted without challenge. Atlas rose and moved to the center, not asserting dominance, simply present. The others adjusted around him, a formation born of memory rather than command. Daniel watched from a distance. He had learned not to interfere with moments like this. Some things healed best when left alone. In the afternoon, children from a nearby school arrived with their teacher, eyes wide and voices hushed as if entering sacred ground. Daniel stood with them, explaining quietly what the dogs had once done, what they no longer needed to do. The children listened, respectful, one small hand reaching out tentatively before pulling back, waiting for permission. Atlas watched from the shade, unmoved by the attention, secure in his place. As evening approached, the light softened again, long shadows stretching across the field. The dog slowed, gathering near the porch as if pulled by gravity. Atlas returned to Daniel's side and sat, not leaning this time, simply close. Daniel rested his hand briefly on Atlas's head, fingers brushing fur worn smooth by time. The world had not changed overnight. Systems still failed. Loyalty was still exploited elsewhere. But here, on this patch of land, something had ended properly. Daniel looked out across the field, the barn, the fence line glowing in the last light. He had kept his promise, not because anyone demanded it, because it mattered. Atlas sighed and lay down, head resting on his paws. Daniel stayed where he was, the quiet settling around them like a final answer. This was where loyalty rested, not in orders, not in contracts, but here in the open, under a sky that asked nothing in return. Sometimes they arrive through loyalty that refuses to die, through courage that chooses compassion when silence would be easier. In this story, no angel appeared, no voice spoke from the heavens, yet something holy still took place. Broken hearts were seen. Forgotten lives were restored. Promises made in the dark were finally honored in the light. God often works through ordinary people who simply decide to do what is right, through a man who would not look away, through animals who never stopped trusting even when the world abandoned them, through quiet choices made when no one was watching. This is how grace moves in the real world. In our daily lives, we are surrounded by those who cannot speak for themselves, the elderly, the wounded, the forgotten, the loyal who gave everything and were left behind. We may not all be Navy SEALs, but every one of us is given moments where we must choose between comfort and conscience, between silence and standing up, between walking past pain or becoming the answer to it. If this story touched your heart, let it be more than just a story. Let it be a reminder that kindness matters, loyalty matters, and doing the right thing still matters, even when it costs us something. Share this message with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment to let others know they are not alone. Subscribe to this channel so more stories like this can reach hearts that are hurting. And before you go, take a moment to pray. May God protect you and your family. May He heal what is broken in your life. May He give you the courage to stand up for those who cannot stand for themselves. If you believe in that prayer, write Amen in the comments.